Hello, welcome to the A-Book 8A channel. Today I want to talk to you about a book called Why Therapy Works, Using Our Minds to Change Our Brains. This is a book with over 270 pages and nearly 200,000 words. Its author, Cozolino, is a renowned American psychologist and a professor of psychology at Pepperdine University. He is well known in the field of psychotherapy. Why did Cozolino write this book? Well, he is not only a theoretical scholar, but also a therapist with nearly 40 years of experience. And when I say therapy, I mean it goes beyond general negative emotions. It's about patients with significant psychological disorders. Cozolino was very skilled in psychotherapy, but one day, he was stumped by a serious question from a visitor. The visitor was a straightforward businessman who asked, "How does this therapy of yours actually make people better? Is there any reliable scientific basis behind it?" These two questions took Cozolino by surprise. He realized that most psychotherapists assumed that their work must be effective. They cared about improving the outcomes of their therapy, but gave little thought to the underlying principles. It's like soldiers on a battlefield who mostly think about how to win the battle rather than what's the purpose of the battle. Of course, psychology, as a professional discipline, has many theories to explain the effectiveness of psychotherapy. Some of these concepts, like systems theory and object relations, are heard often, but these concepts not only have cognitive thresholds but also tend to stay confined within the field. They even make people wonder if psychotherapy is just a set of mysterious jargon meant to cast a spell on people. That's when Cozolino discovered that to explain the principles of psychotherapy, he needed to go back to our brains. How does the brain react to the external world during its evolution? How do the injuries of life get remembered by our brain's neural circuits? What changes occur in a person's brain when they undergo psychotherapy? Only by understanding these questions can you convince ordinary people that psychotherapy and counseling do indeed have value. So, Cozolino spent 2 years and wrote Why Therapy Works in 2015. He didn't use too many convoluted psychological terms, but instead delved into the underlying mechanisms of psychotherapy using neuroscience and brain science knowledge that ordinary people can understand. After reading this book, you will not only better understand the causes of various emotional issues, but also get practical advice from Cozolino on dealing with psychological problems. It's no wonder that the International Society for Functional Neuropsychology recommends that every clinical physician read Cozolino's book. Next, I will introduce the main content of the book in 3 parts. First, let's explore why psychological problems arise in the course of human brain evolution and development, and how these problems affect the brain. In the second part, I will explain the mechanisms through which psychotherapy helps the brain return to a healthy state. Finally, I will summarize the recommendations that author Cozolino makes for our daily mental health. Part 1. Not everyone in their lifetime will necessarily encounter psychological trauma. Many people may never need to step into a counseling room. However, we all have experienced a kind of psychological hurdle at certain times. This hurdle can be painful, fearful, or depressive. What's the physiological mechanism behind this phenomenon of not being able to overcome these hurdles? Author Cozolino tells us that it's related to the human brain. In our impressions, the brain is a flawless, extremely complex and precise machine. The hurdles in our minds, it's like a machine malfunction that needs immediate repair. But Cozolino says, this idea is incorrect. The brain is like a machine with 2 systems, a fast one and a slow one, and it has been pieced together over a long process of evolution. This might sound a bit abstract, so let's use an example. Many people have experienced this. When boiling water, you accidentally touch the scalding kettle and instinctively pull your hand away. Then you start feeling scared. This process, which seems seamless, can actually be divided into 2 independent stages. In the first stage, your hand or body is in action. You feel the pain and start to experience fear due to the physical pain. It's only in the second stage that your thoughts come into play. You start thinking about how severe the injury is, whether you need to bandage it, and by this point, the feeling of fear has gradually reduced. From this example, you'll notice that there's a tiny time gap between the body's reaction and conscious reaction in humans. The body reacts faster, while consciousness is slower. This isn't just a random conclusion, it's scientifically grounded. Our brain processes sensory, motor, and emotional information the fastest, taking only 10 to 50 milliseconds. However, when it comes to thinking or consciously processing information, it requires more neurons and neural systems to be engaged, taking 500 to 600 milliseconds. There's roughly half a second of time difference back and forth, and this time difference is due to the distinction between the brain's fast system and slow system. Why does the same brain have 2 systems? The answer lies in the history of human evolution. Our modern human ancestors evolved from primates about 100,000 years ago. At that time, our brain structure was relatively simple. It was quite similar to the neural structure of mammals or reptiles belonging to the fast system. The existence of the fast system served the most basic survival needs. For example, fear as an emotion is generated by the fast system. It has some negative aspects, but it allows humans and animals to react to danger immediately to protect themselves. After that, it took humans about 50,000 years to evolve enough complexity in the brain to develop logical, imaginative, and empathetic abilities. This is the slow system layered on top of the fast system. Interestingly, the brain's fast system is not only the earliest to appear in evolutionary history, but it also develops first in the growth of infants. This involves an important brain region called the amygdala. The amygdala is closely related to emotional issues. When the amygdala is activated, we can feel fear. Conversely, if someone's amygdala is affected, they may be prone to mental disorders such as anxiety, Alzheimer's disease, and autism. The amygdala, this region matures before a baby is born. In other words, the fetus in the mother's womb already possesses the fast system and can react with fear to negative information. In contrast, our slow system, which consciously applies the brakes to extreme emotions, is unique to the brain's cortical network. However, the brain cortex takes about 20 years or even longer to fully develop. There is a time gap between the two systems. You might be wondering, what's the connection between the fast system and slow system and psychological issues? Don't worry. If you have some knowledge of psychology, you'll realize that counseling and psychotherapy, in particular, emphasize a person's early experiences. For example, the famous Freudian psychoanalysis emphasizes the impact of early childhood experiences. Counselors often advise clients to recall their childhood and their relationships with their parents in an attempt to find underlying factors that trouble them. Why do psychological problems root themselves in a person's early experiences? According to author Cozolino, the issue lies in the time gap between the development of the fast system and the slow system. During infancy and early childhood, the brain cortex is not fully developed, and it cannot actively regulate emotions. In this stage, it's the amygdala and the fast system that plays a role. The state of the amygdala is closely linked to the feedback it receives from the external environment, especially from primary caregivers. This is why a mother's influence on the psychological health of an infant is often crucial. In the common perception, infants and young children are thought to have no psychological activity. They simply eat and sleep when full and play when they wake up. However, this is a misunderstanding. Infants and young children also go through emotional changes and experience pain and discomfort. A child who was peacefully sleeping wakes up suddenly and may have wet the bed or feel hungry, both of which can cause discomfort. A toddler who is just learning to walk stumbles and falls hard after being tripped by furniture. At this moment, besides feeling pain, the child experiences fear. In both scenarios, if caregivers respond promptly to the child's needs and provide comfort, the child's amygdala will receive positive feedback, and the child's emotions will return to a stable state. On the contrary, if caregivers don't respond in time, or worse, react negatively, finding the child bothersome, the child's amygdala will remain in a state of prolonged high stimulation, unable to be suppressed, thus sowing the seeds of psychological issues. Now, a new question arises according to Cozolino. Since the fast system matures earlier, and the slow system matures later, does that mean we can rely on our own regulation ability to resolve psychological issues left from childhood once the slow system is mature? The answer is no, and there are two reasons for this. First, the amygdala, which is a part of the fast system, plays a central role in processing social and emotional information in the brain throughout a person's life. If an individual experienced significant trauma or chronic stress during childhood, their brain development would be directly affected. These individuals may have a larger amygdala. In a resting state, their cortisol, adrenaline, and endorphin levels would be higher than in others. These hormone levels determine the brain's ability to process physiological, psychological, and social information, and they are not controlled by the slow system. In other words, the impact of childhood psychological trauma on the brain might be long-lasting. Furthermore, the slow system, while more complex and advanced, doesn't react based on the objective environment. When we encounter unpleasant situations and feel fear, the brain becomes a search engine. It subconsciously scans a person's memories, body, and emotions, seeking useful information. In terms of proportions, 90% of the neural information input into the brain cortex comes from within. In other words, we actually think and judge based on existing experiences. So if a person's existing experiences and perceptions are problematic, they are prone to falling into a vicious cycle of repeating errors. This is why there's a psychological theory called insecure attachment patterns. It's characterized by people who desire intimate relationships but often engage in avoidance behavior when others approach them. Explained through neuroscience, this phenomenon is essentially the activation of danger signals contained in the amygdala, triggered by intimate relationships. External stimuli awaken long-standing negative neural information, leading to a subsequent flight response. Additionally, research has found that people who have experienced significant trauma in childhood will have an increasingly strong self-preservation instinct, which might even become the sole purpose of their life. In such cases, the brain's activity is entirely controlled by the amygdala, and the slow system cannot exert its regulating influence. Alright, the above is the neuroscience behind psychological issues that Cozolino analyzed for us. You might be wondering again, if psychological issues arise from changes in the brain, why does psychotherapy work? Can simply talking to a counselor really resolve issues? Cozolino provides an explanation. He explains that the reason psychotherapy is effective is that the brain's neurons are plastic. The most basic structural and functional units of the nervous system are neurons. They are born, grow, develop, and connect with each other through structures called synapses. The synaptic structure in the brain is not fixed. As long as there's an appropriate environment and stimulation, neurons release different neurotransmitters, affecting the strength and quantity of synapses, thereby establishing new connections. This process is the basic principle of all human learning activities. As neural connections change, the control of the fast system and slow system in the brain also fluctuates. In his book, Cozolino provides an impressive example. In medicine, there's a term called grasping reflex. It refers to the tendency of infants to grasp onto things with their small hands during the first 2 or 3 months after birth. During this time, if you let the infant grip your finger, you'll find that their grasping strength is strong enough to lift them with just one of your fingers. This grasping reflex is controlled by the brainstem and is a residue of human evolution. In zoos, we often see infant primates, such as chimpanzees and monkeys, tightly grasping their mother's fur and following their mother around, which is the prototype of the grasping reflex. If these animals don't do this, they won't be able to move flexibly in the wild and, thus, won't survive. However, infants lose the grasping reflex after the first 2 or 3 months after birth. It's not because the instinct in the brainstem disappears, but because the brain cortex gradually starts to develop. It sends down fibers to suppress the brainstem's grasping reflex. After all, if a person is constantly controlled by the instinct of the brainstem, always performing the same grasping action, they won't be able to free their hands and perform more complex tasks. This change is also a result of evolution. Interestingly, when an individual gets older and starts displaying symptoms of memory loss, neurologists often perform a test. They ask the patient to extend their arms with their palms facing down. The doctor uses their fingers to trace along the patient's arm from the elbow towards the hand. When they reach the patient's hand, they stimulate the patient's palm with their finger. At this point, if the patient exhibits the grasping reflex, it indicates that the neurons in the frontal and temporal lobes are having issues. The brain cortex is deteriorating, and the brainstem and dormant instincts are regaining the upper hand. The grasping reflex is a vivid example. It proves that the relationship between the slow system and fast system can change under certain conditions. As the brain cortex builds new neural connections and suppresses an overactive amygdala, a person's behavior and responses to the external world change. Psychotherapy stimulates the slow system in individuals, inducing the brain cortex to form new neural connections. How is this stimulation achieved? Cozolino explains it in 2 levels. The first level involves building new interpersonal relationships. We always say that in therapy, it's crucial to have a good fit with the therapist. Even if the therapist is highly reputable, it's not suitable if there's no trust. From this perspective, undergoing psychological counseling and psychotherapy is an attempt to establish a new, positive interpersonal relationship. Interpersonal relationships are important because humans are primarily social animals, and the human brain is a social brain for the human brain. What we call reality is largely based on sociality, where external information is reconstructed. When something can be seen by others, it appears more real. That's why we often find that when children try something new, they ask their parents to watch them, shouting, "Mom, look at me. Dad, watch me." We need to see ourselves through the eyes of others to construct our self-awareness. When a person faces a counselor, they're giving themselves an opportunity to return to that childlike state. The second key tool for psychotherapy is storytelling. In the therapy room, the most important thing clients do is tell their story. Stories are valuable because they involve both language and memory, both of which are related to the activation of the brain cortex. Therapists encourage clients to fully describe the emotions and experiences they've been through. During this process, the person telling the story also sees the reactions of the other person. Through these reactions, they can reevaluate the emotional significance of past experiences. Moreover, the act of storytelling is also a process of creating new memories. In fact, the therapist is going back to the root of the pain with the client, reliving the entire process of emotions from excitement to balance. Each time, when clients fall into fear and self-doubt, worried that the therapist will criticize, humiliate, or even abandon them, if the therapist provides a positive and encouraging response, a new, more positive memory is formed. The next time a negative event occurs, the memory scanned by the brain won't all be distant pain. The response will be richer and further from a vicious cycle. Through interpersonal relationships and storytelling, psychotherapists can stimulate the client's brain cortex, encouraging it to release new descending fibers, strengthening the slow system's regulatory ability, and inhibiting the negative legacy of the fast system. After further activation of the brain cortex, when the client feels fear and stress again, they won't immediately become a captive of the fast system, but will use the slow system to resist imbalance. So, talk therapy is not just simple chit-chat. It's based on a set of principles from neuroscience. The third part. Alright, that's what Cozolino introduced us to. The neuroscience behind psychotherapy. After understanding the why, you probably want to know how. Cozolino provides 3 practical suggestions, especially for regular people who haven't undergone professional psychotherapy. The first suggestion is to learn to activate your prefrontal cortex. As mentioned earlier, to maintain emotional balance, you must allow the prefrontal cortex to suppress the amygdala. Using the slow system to regulate the fast system, activating the prefrontal cortex can be achieved through psychotherapy and counseling, but it can also be actively trained in daily life. Many of us have experienced moments when we suddenly feel fear or anger, and the fires of ignorance rise. However, we often can't pinpoint the exact reasons behind these emotions. When you have these questions, it's an excellent opportunity for self-training. Cozolino gives an example. Clinical physicians in the United States helping alcoholics quit drinking use a technique called HALT training. HALT stands for the first letters of the English words, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. This training involves pausing and asking yourself when you feel the desire to drink, what is causing this desire? Is it hunger, anger, loneliness, fatigue, or other negative emotions? Are there other ways to cope with these emotions besides using alcohol? Once individuals develop the habit of self-questioning and gain insight into the emotional triggers behind their behavior, they can find healthier ways to cope with stress rather than reflexively turning to alcohol. Cozolino suggests that when you find yourself in a state of fear or anger, you can also try asking yourself, what's really behind it? Do I have any means to resolve it? This self-questioning is the most basic form of personal training. Of course, self-questioning must be done carefully to avoid reinforcing inherent biases, especially negative self-talk. Cozolino notes that people often engage in internal dialogues in their minds, which tend to be negative. For instance, a person not satisfied with their body might say to themselves when trying on new clothes, "Why am I so fat?" Or someone who frequently forgets their keys may silently berate themselves saying, "I'm so stupid. How could I forget again?" Cozolino believes that this internal dialogue may appear to express opinions, but it's often a subconscious reflex. Its root lies in inner fears, shame, doubt, and self-evaluation based on these negative emotions. If a person develops a habit of self-deprecation in their mind from time to time, their self-confidence will continuously decline, leading to a vicious cycle. How can you steer clear of self-deprecation? Cozolino's advice is to create your own narrative. As mentioned earlier, psychotherapy involves telling stories, guided by a therapist. Personal narrative, on the other hand, is actively organizing and reviewing your own experiences, sharing them with others. Initially, you might share a simple timeline, such as what happened to you in a particular year. Later, you can start asking yourself questions. For example, if I had made different choices at a certain point in time, would I be more successful or happier now? Did I give up my dreams because I was afraid my family would disapprove? And would they really have disapproved? Questions like these. Cozolino explains that the process of building a narrative is, in fact, a process of liberating yourself from the story. It's like taking off an old shirt, mending the tears, and putting it back on. During the process of creating a narrative, the prefrontal cortex's function is further activated, and the amygdala's activity decreases. Anxiety and fear also diminish. If you find it awkward to share your story with others, you can try writing about your experiences in a journal, which has a similar effect. When we can examine our own narrative, establish new self-evaluations and perceptions, we gain the ability to change our lives. Cozolino's second suggestion is to learn to be angry. He found that many people suffer because they play the role of submissive individuals in their social relationships. This role can lead to two extremes. One is hysterical outbursts of violence directed at those closest and most vulnerable, such as partners and children. The other extreme is a complete loss of the ability to feel anger. So what does it mean to lose anger? This takes us back to the amygdala. The brain processes the pattern of the submissive role similar to trauma, and it's mainly controlled by the amygdala. When a submissive person encounters their leader, they form a memory if I display confidence, anger, or dissatisfaction. It will enrage the other person, leading to irreparable consequences. At this point, the amygdala equates anger with danger and fear, creating a conditioned reflex. To protect the submissive individual from danger, the amygdala directly suppresses the emotion of anger. As a result, the regulation capacity of the prefrontal cortex is weakened, leading to an emotional illness. Cozolino encountered a visitor in therapy who was troubled by this emotional illness. His name was Sandy, a talented engineer, but he played the submissive role in both work and family life. After over a decade of going along with everything, Sandy found himself unable to live a normal life. When a client asked him to present his new invention, he would avoid it out of fear of failure and confrontation. His marriage was on the verge of falling apart due to the accumulated burden. Cozolino discovered that Sandy's pattern of social interaction was influenced by his original family. His father was skilled in both physical and psychological abuse, the source of Sandy's childhood fears. However, his mother was quiet and loyal, willing to swallow her grievances to maintain family unity. Sandy identified with his mother and imitated her avoidance habits in the face of conflict, ultimately becoming a desperate submissive. The treatment advice Cozolino gave Sandy was to first experience the feeling of anger. He asked Sandy to imagine a scenario. One day, you're out with your daughter, and someone suddenly tries to abduct her. How would you react? Initially, Sandy felt fear, with tears in his eyes. However, love eventually prevailed. He began to shout that he would not let anyone take his daughter as long as he had breath. He would even pounce and bite the kidnapper's neck. At this point, Cozolino intervened. He told Sandy that although you've become accustomed to the role of a submissive and labeled yourself as a coward, that's not the true and complete you. You need to experience the feeling of anger at this moment and harness the power it brings, rather than letting fear crush you. After dealing with the emotion of anger, Cozolino offered a third suggestion, which is to confront fear. These 4 words may sound simple, but they are based on a set of neuroscience principles. As mentioned earlier, fear, as an emotion, is predominantly governed by the amygdala. It suppresses the higher-level thinking capacity of the prefrontal cortex, preventing us from further analyzing and solving problems. The amygdala corresponds to the brain's instinct for survival. When we become accustomed to avoiding fear and are unwilling to face anything new or challenging, the amygdala further strengthens the survival first strategy, sometimes even rejecting happiness to ensure survival. Confronting fear is about retraining your amygdala and sympathetic nervous system so that they don't instantly react and dominate the nervous system every time they encounter something unfamiliar. This process is undoubtedly challenging, but if it helps us discover more possibilities in life and experience greater happiness, it's worth it. Conclusion: that's the main content of the book Why Therapy Works, introduced up to this point. I hope this book has provided you with a deeper understanding of the neurological mechanisms behind psychological issues, and has given you more awareness and courage to confront the inner demons you might face. Each one of us hopes to minimize pain in our lives, which is why we seek help from psychology. However, there's one particular passage in Cozolino's book that touched me deeply. He said that in reality, pain is inseparable from life. Desires lead to disappointments, love leads to experiences of loss, and life, from the moment of birth, inevitably progresses toward aging and death. As a result, Cozolino reflects that what we should pursue is not an absence of suffering, but an absence of torment. Torment arises when we worry about not getting what we desire or losing what we already have, leading to distress. This is a form of anticipatory anxiety. When we become entangled in torment, regardless of how much we already possess, we continue to feel dissatisfied, and ultimately, happiness drifts further away. For someone who yearns for happiness, it's important not only to consciously train their slow system to develop healthy self-regulation abilities, but also to be vigilant about the emergence of tormenting emotions. After all, your happiness largely depends on you. That's the essence of this book. Please feel free to share. Congratulations, you finished another book.